So this is Joey Plaster, and we're with Garrett. Is
Glaser.
it Glaser?
Mhm.
Glaser, and it is May the 4th, and we're just doing a pre-interview chat in his
Home
office. Yeah. Okay.
So I was just saying, like, I'm working on a memoir, as is everyone, but a lot of it has to do with that time around Stonewall. I was 16, and being exposed not just to Stonewall, but paying a visit to the local Mattachine office or going to the Gay Liberation Front dances or hanging out on Christopher Street. All of it meant that I came to get that being gay was not only okay, but there, I know it sounds la-di-da, that I had a responsibility to be active politically. And so I went on, continued with my career as a reporter, but all the time I was out. And so it, those early days had an impact on the way I lived my life. And I had been exposed to gay men who were very secretive, and I didn't want to live like that. My parents had friends who were gay, but very closeted. One was married, I remember, and it's not something you would discuss in the living room. So anyway, basically, this is remembrances of career, but also being out. And that bag down there, I just got out of storage, and it's full of memorabilia about that.
Do you want to just describe a few of the?
Yeah, this is an article from the calendar section of the LA Times. They did a thing on the fact that here was this reporter at Channel 4 in Los Angeles who was out. I had a entertainment news segment I did every day, and I had spent a lifetime in hard news, but I switched to entertainment and media. So they thought it was interesting that, like, the guy from the LA Times walked into my cubicle to do the interview, I remember, and I had a big sign that I had put up front. I stole it or took it after a protest, an ACT UP thing, and it said, "Hollywood, stop censoring our queer lives." So he thought, wow, that's unusual for someone who's on the air at NBC. So it's full of things like that. An award from the National Lesbian Gay Journalists Association for being out. It's like, of course, it was never, I gotta tell you, I was never like, I have to be out. It was like, I'm out anyway, get some publicity. Maybe it'll help my career. That's what I was thinking. So I wasn't trying to save anybody or anything. But I used to get letters from viewers saying thank you. And I also got letters from viewers saying drop dead. But, it was nice to get letters from young people who were like, thank you, you're a role model, I appreciate it, blah, blah, blah. It meant a lot.
And maybe a lot of that harkens back to when you were a teenager in the 60s, yeah.
There was nobody, I mean, to actually see people working in an office in 67 or 68, and they were working, sending out mailings and doing stuff to attempt to either change laws in New York State or change attitudes. I thought that was really cool. They weren't ashamed. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't in the dark. It was on a busy corner. You could say people didn't know what Mattachine meant when it said Mattachine Society. But they were pretty out there.
Well,
anyway.
So let's here.
Just that this man had that on. Anyway, so I'll save all that. Okay. Oh, 1968. I'm 15. My mother's boyfriend takes me to see a documentary on drag queens called The Queen, which was strange when you think of it. And I wasn't really out yet, but I remember thinking it was sad. So. Okay. You're going to talk to Robert Bryan.
Yeah.
About Kite Sheridan Square. Okay. I'm up to speed.
Okay. Yeah.
You can look at anything you want there.
Okay. I'm just gonna.
H4N.
Robert Bryan. I'm interviewing him Tuesday.
He was the first boyfriend.
Your first boyfriend, okay. So let's go ahead and start, even though we've already really started. Again, Joey Plaster interviewing
Garrett Glaser.
Glaser. And date is Friday, May 4th. We're at Garrett's apartment. It's 78 degrees out in Manhattan.
Is it 78?
Yes.
It feels hot.
Yeah. And so we'll go ahead and start. Maybe you can just give me a little bit of background leading up to the age of, I don't know, 14 or 16. Some of the kind of relevant life events that led you to the Mattachine offices, maybe.
If I go back really young, you know who Betty Friedan was?
Mm-hmm.
I went to Dalton, a block from here, for school in 8th grade and through high school. Her son went there. I remember John Friedan calling me Fairy Boy when I was 12. And I think a lot of guys thought I was gay before I even knew I was gay. I just, I was just so. I liked everything just so, and I was opinionated and all that. So...
And this was in Manhattan?
This was, 89th Street and Park at 1965. I switched from public school to Dalton. It's so weird that we moved here a block away, but, I've lived all over the country. So anyway, I can remember from very young, being interested in other boys and not really being like other boys when it came to liking girls. And it was just kind of a given. I think there was one point where I thought to myself, gosh, I don't want to tell my mom and dad because they'll be disappointed in me. But that feeling went away pretty quickly. And there's actually a friend of my mom who is now about 90, who lives a few blocks from here, and she reminded me last year, she said, I was at your apartment with your mother and sister in 64 or 5 when you announced to all of us that you were going to be gay. You said this at a dinner, and my mother tried to make a joke of it, and Daisy, this friend, didn't say anything. It was just kind of like quiet. But I said, I want you to know that I'm going to be gay. I knew enough then that I was going to be true to myself.
So that would have been unusual at that time,
it
right?
was.
Or was it less unusual because it was Manhattan and...
I don't know what got into me. I think maybe I was being not combative, but kind of provocative.
Mm-hmm.
I had forgotten that I did that, and I'm impressed now that I did. I'll tell you a funny story. In 1970, just after Stonewall, I went away, almost a year after Stonewall, I went away to the University of California, Irvine, to study and to work at a factory. I wanted a summer in California. And when I came back at the end of the summer, I said to my mom, Mom, I'm gay. There's no question about it. I know I'm gay. I went to a gay bar in California, and that's what I am. And she said, she freaked. And all of a sudden she said, we're going to put a stop to this young man right now. And she said, you're going to a psychiatrist. And she sent me to go twice a week to this psychiatrist at the Postgraduate Center for Psychotherapy on 30th Street. And then after a month or two, she said, how's it going with your therapist, dear? And I said, it's good. And she said, what are you talking about? And I said, we're talking about problems getting and keeping boyfriends. And this made her crazy. And she said, he sounds as gay as you, that shrink. And anyway, within a short time, she was totally accepting. And if I told her this story, she wouldn't even remember it. Mm-hmm. But for a little bit there, she was very, you're not going to do this, thinking that sexuality was just, maybe I was just trying to be outrageous or something.
Right. So what did your parents do for work? What were their politics and their views on sexuality?
My mom, they were both center left, but mostly center. My father had gone to Tufts and was a magazine editor, and he was, they had gay friends, he and his wife, and I don't know. I knew that he didn't treat gay people quite as seriously as straight men. The gay men they knew were like window dressers and hairdressers and stuff like that. So they thought they were amusing, but they didn't. I never thought he really treated him the way he would a straight male colleague. My mom grew up, ran away from home in Boston at a very young age, and eventually went into the Marine Corps in '44, came to New York when she got out, and worked for Radio Free Europe, Crusade for Freedom, which was at the time of, fight the communist kind of thing. And she, in many ways, was, pretty liberal, but in some ways she wasn't. And I think I remember when she told my dad, she said, Garrett told me that he's sure he's a homosexual, he's sure he's going to be gay. And my father called me up on the phone, and I remember my mother said, honey, it's your dad, because they were divorced. And so he calls on like a Friday afternoon, and hi, Dad, and I knew she had told him. And he said, hello, son, your mother tells me you have a problem, but we're going to get to the bottom of this. Don't worry. And I said, okay, Dad. And that was kind of, he too came around. He even said once, I'm proud of you. So, they both came around pretty quickly.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that you grew up around gay men, even if they were the kind of like effeminate window dresser stereotype. So was that kind of an open secret, or were there conversations?
It was never discussed. It was an open secret. They were very queenie, most of them, and so they would be like, hi, Mary, hi, Garrett. That's So everybody thought it was kind of funny. No one ever said he's gay. I think once someone said, he's been with his friend for 14 years, kind of thing.
Yeah. That
was as close as it ever got to saying they were in a gay relationship. I just remembered this. My mom and stepdad rented a house in Fire Island Pines in maybe 62 or 63 for the summer. And later, when I said, Mom, how come we never went there after that summer? She said, oh, your stepfather thought maybe it wasn't a good influence on you to be around all those guys. I said, really? Because I wasn't even aware that they were gay. I just thought it was guys, lots of guys. It's funny, I totally forgot. Why would they have picked Fire Island Pines out of all the communities in Fire Island to summer in? It made no sense. I'm just trying to think of other stuff. Oh, how about when I was 6? We're living in Peter Cooper downtown. I go out, my dad and his best friend took me out to go somewhere, I don't know, have a malted or something. And I remember we got out to First Avenue, and they said, we'll get a cab. And so I said, I'll get it. And I held out my hand to get a cab, and I did this, and a cab stopped. But my father decided he didn't want a cab, and he had to say something to the cab driver to explain, so he said, no, never mind, he's just drying his nails. And he and his friend thought this was pretty funny. So he must have, he once said to me, Phil, his best friend, has been telling me for years that I ought to get you playing sports and stuff, because he said if I don't, you're going to turn into a pansy. And so they must have sensed, before I did, that it's just kind of what I was. It's a good thing.
And so what led you to the Mattachine offices when you were 16? What is the series of events?
It's so funny. I had a friend at school who was a very wealthy kid, lived on Fifth Avenue with his family. And I used to go over there, and we would fool around after school in the afternoons.
This was when you were how old?
12, 13, 14. And we used to go on trips. We used to go down to 42nd Street, and it was full of dirty bookstores then. And I would try, and he would be with me. We would try to get in, and so we could buy some dirty magazines, most of which were physique at that time, not nude. But the famous story is we went to Bob's Bargain Books on 42nd, west of 6th. All this is gone now. It's a big, fancy office building. But I said, okay, you're ready? We're going to go in. I think the male ones are at the back on the right. And there were a lot of guys going in and out. We figured we'd just sneak in. Now, mind you, we're 14 or 15. So we go in, and in about literally 2 seconds, you hear, "You, out!" like that. And he was pointing at me, and I was horrified. So I snuck back. I went out. But somehow Orville got in, and it seemed like I was standing outside 10 minutes. They hadn't stopped him. I didn't know what he was doing, but he finally comes out with nothing in his hand. And I said, "Well, did you find any dirty magazines?" And he said, "Of course." He said, "What do you want me to get?" And I said, "I don't know, pick the magazines with the cutest guys, and I'll pay you back." So he went back in and bought Mr. Sun. Oh, Amos, you scared. You scared Joey.
Forgot there was a dog.
He got a haircut yesterday.
So did he look older than you?
He looked maybe a year older,
okay.
But he really wasn't, but he looked it. And he always wore a suit and tie and had little glasses. He was kind of a prim and proper kid. So he went in, bought them, and we also went to the Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookstore, which was started by Craig Rodwell. And this would have been in 68 or 9, before Stonewall. We went down there to Mercer Street after school and bought some more male nudist magazines, not hardcore, just male nudes. And that became a famous bookstore in New York. It eventually moved to Christopher Street and was one of the original bookstores for gay people. Craig Rodwell's been profiled and stuff. I think he's gone now. But anyway, so we were into kind of exploring New York, and we knew there were homosexuals where we lived in New York. It was a big city. Every so often you'd see stuff in the newspaper about, the famous one about Stonewall, Queen Bee's Stinging Mad was the headline in the Village Voice. Every so often you would see stuff regarding homosexuals. So I'm just thinking about the famous CBS reports called The Homosexuals, and I don't know what year that was. I could look it up. But so we knew there was stuff going on, and somehow in a New York Times piece it had mentioned research by the Mattachine Society, and I said, I'm going to look them up. And I looked in the phone book, I think, and lo and behold, it said Mattachine Society, West End Avenue. And we went over there after school, I think a Friday afternoon. Maybe we even took a taxi. It was on the other side of town. It was in an old dentist's office. What had been a dentist's office in an old pre-war building, like an apartment building. And they had the street level space.
And what neighborhood again?
This was 71st and West End, Upper West Side.
Okay.
Not particularly, it was a quiet residential neighborhood. Dick Leitch, the president then, would know why they were there. I have no idea why they located there. Maybe somebody said, I'll rent you space. So we knocked, and a guy answered, and he became our friend. And he showed us around, introduced us to the president, and had us stuffing envelopes in 10 minutes. And his name was Fred Malcolm. He ran something called the American Language Institute at NYU, which was basically ESL stuff. And he's been honored and all that, but he took me out to Julius, my first gay bar. I think I was 15, maybe 16. And of course they let me in. No, back then it wasn't a big deal. I don't remember ever being told you're too young for a cocktail. Now, of course, they card you and everything. But it was just different then, and friendlier and softer and more civilized, I think.
So what year was that when you first went to Mattachine?
That was, I would say, spring of 68.
Spring of 68. And how old were you then?
I was 15.
15? Okay.
Now, maybe I was 16. Maybe it was half a year later. But it was right around there, and it was before Stonewall. It's funny because I know it sounds weird to say, but after Stonewall, I felt like everybody was gay all of a sudden, and it wasn't so special anymore. And there's a guy named Arthur Bell who was a gay reporter, columnist, critic for the Village Voice, who used to say, when gay liberation came out of the closet, romance went in. Because all of a sudden, it wasn't so easy to find somebody because everybody in the world was gay. So when you had a smaller pot and fewer places and fewer people in each place, you would hook up more easily. And now, of course, it's funny, there aren't really gay neighborhoods anymore in New York because everything seems very mixed. It used to be a few gay neighborhoods. It's no more that way. How old are you?
I'm 39.
Oh, well, you remember some of this, but people, people today who are 22, they really have no idea how it was so segregated and gay bar and no straight person would go in. Now there's everybody in bars and it's all mixed up.
Can you tell me more about the Mattachine office? I am like, what did it feel like to be
there?
Well,
it was thrilling, actually, because it's kind of, and mind you, it turns out my friend turned out not to be gay. Even though we fooled around a lot, he was just like exploring. But for me, a gay kid who knew he was gay, to find Mattachine was like, wow, these are serious people doing serious work, and everyone was very friendly and professional. And I was just kind of shocked. And I felt like I had discovered this secret world, and I loved it. I felt comforted by it.
So were these the first gay men you met who weren't like the kind of flaming interior decorator types? Or okay.
It's interesting that the director of the middle school at Dalton was a man named Michael Casey, who was a brilliant man and a wonderful educator, and he was gay, and he was rather effeminate. And I had actually done an imitation of him in a high school talent show, imitating his mannerisms. But it wasn't mean, it was kind of sweet. And, I guess we knew he was gay, but nobody said he was gay. But I remember thinking, he's gay, and he's a smart guy, and he's doing important stuff. And the head of the lower school was also gay. So, which is not to say that that Dalton was okay with gay kids. When I graduated, along with another gay kid, I was told that the headmaster, Donald Barr, said to his assistant, Georgia, we just graduated our first 2 fags. And when I was told that, I thought, fuck no, there must have been dozens over the years. You just didn't know. But, he was kind of a Republican, What's really funny is, today, it seems very kind of, parents are on the left there. And you would think they'd be, they say they're totally accepting of their gay kids and their trans kids. But I went to a recent social thing. I get a vibe that they'd be horrified if their own kid was gay. I just do. They all speak the talk, and walk the walk. But I really wonder how comfy these people are. So anyway, Mattachine had glass paned windows, beautiful old leaded windows in this building, and it was only 2 rooms, brightly lit. One room was like laid out with Mimeo machines and, I forget what they used to call those things, and envelopes and mailing labels, And the back belonged to Dick Leitch, the president, and he had a desk, and he was kind of he did lobbying, and it was all kind of shocking back then. I think for a legislator to get a letter from a group of representing homosexuals, it was not discussed. Or if it was discussed, I knew some, would joke about it. Hey, the homosexuals are writing to me, kind of thing. It was so different. But it meant a lot to be exposed to that. And of course, Stonewall, I wasn't there that night, but I was there the next night. And I saw people from Mattachine there. and I went there with Fred Malcolm, who's from NYU, and we were there early, and we walked around. I'd heard what had happened.
Well, before we get to Stonewall, let's talk a little bit more about Mattachine. How many people were generally there? Who were some of the most important people you met, and what were their goals? I guess what were they trying to do?
There was when I went there that time, there were only 5 guys there working, and they were mostly volunteers. When I went back, I didn't go back to that office. I went to other places because it was after Stonewall. It was right after Stonewall. So what happened was I did Mattachine, and then I kind of discovered, oh, I can get into gay bars, and I never went back to that office, and I didn't get active again until right after Stonewall, when I went to Church of the Holy Apostles on 9th Avenue, where GLF first met, and Alternate U on West 14th Street, where GLF had Friday night dances, and later 73 was the firehouse, the GAA firehouse on Worcester Street, and there was also a gay pre-firehouse thing located in an old firehouse on West 3rd Street, and I would go, and back then there were groups called Gay Youth, and if you were like 13 to 18, you would go to Gay Youth. And you don't hear much about that anymore. People don't remember those groups. This is pre-PFLAG.
Right. Yeah. I think Mark Horn was involved in that.
Yes.
Yeah. But it was somebody from somebody from Mattachine that introduced you to the gay bars.
Yes, Fred did, and he kind of gave me the lay of the land. He told me this place is gay, that place is gay, and he told me about he had gone to Paris on vacation, and he said he went to the Tuileries, the gardens where at night they were very active for sex. So I said, is there a place like that here? You probably don't want the sex stuff, but I'll give it to you. So I'm 16, and I would not leave Fred alone. I said, where do people go for sex? It didn't occur to me that people go home to have sex. I figured they must be having sex, and I'm missing it. So he said, well, there's the trucks, but I don't want to take you over there. And these were big trucks that parked near the West Side Highway at night. And gay men, after they would come out of bars, feeling good, would go into these empty trucks. They'd jump up into the trucks in the back and have sex. So I just kept bothering him, and he said, okay, we'll walk over to the trucks. And it was way far west of Sheridan Square. And I went, and I thought it was the greatest thing I ever saw. So exciting. And I mean, men were old, young, black, white, skinny, fat, cute, not so cute. It was such a democracy, or such a melting pot. You know, now it's like, well, this bar gets this kind of gay. You know, if you're countercultural, you go East Village. If you're kind of rocky, and others, you know, you'd go to the bar on 58th Street if you're an old gay in a button-down shirt, and every bar seemed to have a type now, and back then it was really a democracy. You were just shoved into a place, and there were so many kinds of men, and the only thing holding you together was that you were all gay. You were all homosexual, and you all knew what it meant to go through, to experience hatred. You know what's nice is you're kind of acculturated. Back then, if you were a young gay kid, most people were told, you're a piece of shit, you don't deserve to live, you're sick, you're perverted, you'll never find happiness. And to find people who said, I don't give a shit, I'm going to live my life, and they were happy, it was like I died and went to heaven. So for me, it kind of, Mattachine and going through all the gay revolution really made a big difference in my life. I kind of came of age and found myself at the same time as that was going on.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the bars you went to before Stonewall?
Oh God,
some of the names, like what was it?
Well,
like
my
to
famous story is the Salvation. Salvation was at 1 Sheridan Square in the basement, which had been a very famous nightclub owned by Barney Josephson where Billie Holiday got her start, called Cafe Society in the 40s. That space, I found out later, had turned into kind of a disco, and that had, after a while, fallen down, and it became gay. Frequently back then, gay bars were in spaces that had been straight bars and failed. And so they would let the gays in later. Maybe we can make it as a gay bar. Appeal to the fruits. So I went there after Julius one night, and I was by myself, and it was probably midnight. And I'm 16. This is 3 or 4 months before Stonewall. It was very hot out. I mean, very cold out. It was winter. And I had heard about it. I heard it was an after-hours club, and there were really cute guys there. So I was very close to Julius. I walked a few blocks, and I see this red light outside. Didn't say Salvation and anything. So I knocked, and I heard a buzzer. So I pushed the door open, and the door closes behind me and locks. And the door in front of me is locked. So I'm in this little space, and you hear on a speaker, "Hello?" And I said, "Hello, yes, I want to go to the Salvation." And I think he was looking at me from behind a one-way mirror. And I could almost feel him checking me out. And he goes, "Do you know what it is?" And I said, "Sure, I know. It's a gay bar." Bzz, the next door opens. He buzzed me in. And I went downstairs, and sure enough, had a great sound system. It was small, but really cool and secretive. And the fact is, you had to go through that little thing every time you went in or out of the bar. Maybe they were afraid of being busted, I don't know. Then I found out years later, Faye Dunaway was one of the owners.
Huh.
Isn't that weird?
That's weird. So was that typical of the other bars you went to? Or?
Well,
I mean, how open or secretive were most of the bars?
Well, the ones, early on, before Stonewall, on 10th or in the West Village, you could walk in, but there was no such thing as a rainbow flag. They looked like any other place, and they were usually quiet. You didn't hear music coming out of them. They were kind of little quiet places. That changed, of course, after Stonewall. But I remember a couple of times thinking, if this is before Stonewall, I would go with Fred to places. And I remember thinking, if the outside world only knew that this place was all homosexuals, I just thought it was the coolest thing. It was a secret society right in front of you.
You know? And it was the same thing with the trucks you were mentioning.
Yeah. It was it was so exciting. It was a secret society. These are guys who liked guys just like me. And it was the first time I was together with other gay men. I guess Julius was. I remember going into Julius he took me in, and it was like 8:30 on a weeknight. I don't know what I told my mom where I was going, but I walked in with him, and I was so nervous. I was shaking because I was in a gay bar. And I just remember thinking, oh my God, I hope nothing happens to me. Because I was young and kind of naive, you know. And I went in, all these guys who looked like Madison Avenue advertising guys sitting around having cocktails and chatting. It was loud. There are pictures of Stonewall back then. There were famous photos that they've used. And there was just a sip-in at Julius, a few weeks ago, honoring Dick Leitch. Honoring the sip-in from 66? 66, yeah. So I wanted to go but didn't, and I liked everything about it.
So you went to Mattachine, and that was political, but do you remember other political organizations or people having conversation about politics?
That's a good question.
Or were you a teenager looking for sex, really, at the time?
Well, I had it's really interesting. A year or two before, I had gone to Mattachine. I went 2 blocks from my house on 72nd and 2nd, and there was a storefront for a state assemblyman. and he was now running for state senate. And it was like we had back then little neighborhood political headquarters. And his name was John Burns, and he was a Republican liberal, RL. He ran on both lines. And I went in there and volunteered every day after school, making calls, stuffing envelopes, stuff like that. I must have been 12. One day, I'm sorry to go on so long, but I'm doing a delivery for that. We're delivering a box of envelopes or something somewhere. And so I'm with a guy named Wayne Friday. And we're in a car, and he's driving, and I'm helping carry the boxes. And he says something. We're going up 3rd Avenue, and he says something like, I said, I really like working in the office. Everybody's really nice, and it's a cool place. And he says, yeah, it's a cool place. Of course, they're all a bunch of fags. And I said, what? And he said, yeah, they're all fags. He said, Burns is a fag. He may be a Christian Scientist and goes out with women, but he likes guys. They all do, he says. And I just remember thinking, being shocked. And I didn't know if I believed it or not. But looking back, I think some of those guys who were married and who were Republicans also had boyfriends. And it still goes on some places like that. It's crazy in this day that people still do that.
Was the same true of Wayne Friday?
I think Wayne was straight.
Okay.
I think he was racist. He was a real Republican, kind of waspy guy who came, I think, from the Midwest, and had moved to New York. I couldn't believe he said it. It had never occurred to me, That's a really interesting thing sometimes for someone to explore, is the duality of realizing someone is that way, but not ever discussing it. Making room for them in your mind as acceptable, and yet if it was discussed, maybe they would be unacceptable. But because we know him and he's nice and we're used to him, he's okay. So let's not discuss his sexuality.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. That kind of like open secret kind of
open secret.
Yeah.
So, but I'm thinking about, it's funny though, in terms of political, I saw John Kennedy when I was 6 at a rally near my apartment in Lower Manhattan. I saw Bobby Kennedy on my corner, 72nd and 2nd in 68. He was running, I guess, for Senate? I always had found politics kind of interesting, and it was nice to be a kid who could be involved because they let me do things like that. Interesting, one day, a guy named George Kalkinis, who was the campaign manager, was talking to someone in that re-election office on 2nd Avenue, and I hear him say, "Hey, I got a letter from the Mattakine Society." And I don't know what it was about, but I heard that, and I was immediately like, oh my God, he knows about it. And I guess they were writing to candidates for some reason. But I didn't say a word. I was, very young. So even then I knew about the Mattachine Society.
Wait, so that was before you actually went
Yes,
to the
that was
offices?
several years before I went.
Okay.
It was thrilling to even know that such a thing was there.
Wow.
They'd
So
been
you must
around
have
since
read about it
1950.
in,
Because it
the
was mentioned
newspaper or something,
in the Times, in the Herald Tribune. There was back then the Daily Mirror, the Journal American, World Telegram, and Sun. So many fucking papers.
Yeah.
It was such. I wish you could have been in the city then. It was
Sounds
very
fun.
alive.
Yeah.
It was fun. Yeah. Anyway.
Well, so maybe moving forward to Stonewall, how did you weren't there that first night, but how
No.
did you hear about it?
Oh God. It was.
How did you come to be there the second night?
I had been going down to the Village a few, 5 or 6 times, walking around Christopher Street, and I didn't. What happened was really interesting. My mom took me out to lunch one day and said, you may have multiple sclerosis, because I had gone on a ski trip and came back and had a hard time talking. And they did some tests and they thought I may have it. Well, indeed I did, but I didn't pay attention to it. So she said, And I don't want you going out at night so much. You're a young man, you're 16 years old, and you're always out, and that's going to stop. So I was careful to kind of slow down my explorations at night. So some nights I would stay home. And I think it was on the radio the next day, they talked about homosexuals rioting and attacking police officers. And my heart went like this. Mm-hmm. And I think I called Fred and said, I want to go down there and see it the next day. Mm-hmm. And so we met up really early.
This is Fred from the Management Society?
Yeah, from Management.
Okay.
He lived in very close to that. So we go, and it must be 8:30, and we're walking around, and we run into a guy Fred knew named Bob Kite, Robert Kite, K-I-G-H-T, and he was an activist then, and I think he was part of Management, but I may be wrong. Flaming blonde hair, and we run into him on Sheridan Square. And he's very busy, and he has a notepad, and he's taking notes, and there's people all over walking around, and everybody is abuzz with, did you hear what happened last night? There was a riot. And Fred said, so, Bob, what's the latest? And Bob says, well, I have a report that the police are doing such and such, and he may have said there are going to be demonstrations later. I don't remember. All I know is I got home by like 11, and nothing had happened. Robert Bryan told me later, he said it was crazy. The second and third nights they were still rioting. I had no idea because I would go home early to be a good boy. Mm. So I kind of missed out on it.
And so you had met Robert by that time?
Well, it's funny. I just had a conversation with him, and I said, I met you before Stonewall. I met him in the trucks, and I think it was 2 months before Stonewall. He said, I'm not sure. He's not positive about that. He thought maybe it was after. But I think summer of 70 I went away, and we had already been going out for almost a year, so it had to be 69. His story, that night when he had come from Virginia like 3 or 4 years prior, and he was very into gay stuff. I mean, he wasn't political, but he was very social. Mm-hmm. And he'll tell you, I won't tell you, but after a while, he was so disgusted by what he saw that first night that he picked up, I think, a brick and threw something at a cop, and the cop turned around during the riot, and he turned around, and another cop sees it and starts chasing Robert. And Robert's very tall. And Robert runs, and he runs blocks and blocks and blocks all the way back to his apartment on Thompson, and this cop is chasing him. Finally, the cop gave up, and Robert outran him by the time he got home. Mm-hmm. And Robert worked at a bank at the time, and, it was kind of like, what the fuck is going on?
Yeah.
You wear a suit. But it was a crazy time. People were tired of shit,
Right. Can you tell me more about meeting him? So you met him
at the trucks. And I shouldn't tell you these stories, but I know they probably won't be used, but they are very funny. I had decided right around then I was going to kind of be a more flamboyant homosexual. I thought I was just too common, and I wanted to be like some of the ones I saw. And so I went out with my mom, and one Saturday I bought a pair of elephant bell-bottoms, purple, and a shirt of a different purple, and a sash that was purple paisley. I mean, I was determined to look like the biggest queen I could. And I remember Fred saying, I don't like the new you, he said. But so for a short time, I would dress just outrageously. And so that one night, I happened to go to the trucks, and Robert was there, and he was very young and attractive.
He was your age, or?
No, he told me he was. He was 8 years older.
Oh, okay.
But he thought if I knew he was 25, that I wouldn't want it. Mm. So I thought he was right around my age, and so he drops to his knees, I guess, to do me, and he starts fidgeting with this belt, and he couldn't get it undone. And I always remember he looked at him and said, "What is this, a chastity belt?" But it was great, and yeah. So I forget what you asked me. Oh, just Robert. So people back then, just because you have sex with someone at the trucks doesn't mean you're going to ever talk to them or know them or get to know them. But I said to him, I can't believe I remember this. I said that night at the end of our fooling around, "What's your phone number? What's your name?" And he says, "Robert." And I said, "Robert what?" He says, "Robert Elliott Bryan." And I said, "How do you spell it?" And he's Bryan. So that night, or that morning, let's say it was probably midnight or 1, I get home, and the next morning, my mother's gone out. I'm looking through the white pages for Robert E. Bryan, and I find him on Thompson Street. And I call him that next day, and he said later he was shocked because he said, "No one ever called me that I met at the trucks, and it was so soon. It was like you were not afraid to throw yourself at me." And I said, "Well, I mean, you were cute, and I was cute, and I liked you." And I came over, and it was, at the time, the apartment was quite dumpy, and I laid on the sofa. This is the next day. And I crying, I said, "I'm in love with you, I'm in love with you." And so we moved in together and went out for a couple of years.
You moved in together when you were how old?
17.
17. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And you lived with one another?
Yeah, we did, and
Okay.
the rent was $92.80 a month, which
Yeah.
we split. It was a railroad flat, and it had like a bunk bed on stilts, in the back. And I remember we would come home after work. I would think I was working for a movie company then, or maybe in college too, at Hunter, and we'd come home at night and we would have sex every night, which has never happened the rest of my life. So I don't know. I must have been young and full of raging hormones. It was great.
Okay, and so I'm going to talk with him on Tuesday, and
He has great stories.
He was there at the riots and told you about them afterwards.
I wanted to know all about him, and he said, "Well, it was quite something, and the queens were throwing things, those pigs." And mind you, he worked in a bank. I mean, he was not super liberal, but I think there was a feeling like we had had enough. Like everybody had heard stories over the months or years that this shit went on. People would get busted. The famous stories about people in bars, if they thought it was going to be raided, just as the police would come in, they would drop their IDs on the floor. They didn't want to have ID on them. And sometimes the police would say, "Put your hands against the bar," and they'd ask them all sorts of insulting questions. And so, I'd heard about it, but I never experienced it. Maybe Robert had experienced it, I don't know, but it's interesting that he was so maddened that he threw things at the policeman.
And what do you remember thinking about this at the time? Did it seem momentous? Did it seem just like something that had happened?
You know what? It's like, you remember, like, I had gone as a 14-year-old to the Pentagon, the March on the Pentagon, that Norman Mailer wrote a book about, the armies of the night protesting Vietnam. I thought it was one more political protest. I didn't necessarily believe it was going to lead to anything big. But there were, at that time, in 68 and 69, lots of protests on all kinds of things. So I just thought, oh, my people are protesting. But it was like you would see in the paper, the birth of gay liberation. The smart people knew it was momentous. A lot of people just thought, "Honey, didn't we give it to the cops the other night? Yeah, good for us." It was like that. It was like people didn't take it all that seriously. It was just a payback thing. And then as time went by, one thing led to another, and I came to realize the world was now different.
Yeah. And so talk about that. How did you start getting involved in politics? Like, I guess, Gay Liberation Front. What happened after Stonewall?
Well, I don't know if you know these guys doing oral history of people who used to go to the Gay dances at Columbia University.
I saw that online.
Earl
Yeah,
Hall.
I
They
saw that
just
you
got
talked
it
about
named.
that.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
got it named as a thing.
National Historic
Yeah.
Property or something.
They're two like architectural historians, nice
Mm-hmm.
guys. So I used to go to that, and I used to go to, being young and wanting to go out late at night. Now we actually have a gay bar up here on the Upper East Side that recently opened last year called Boxers UES. And every fucking Saturday I say to David, my partner of 18 years, we're going to go out tonight. We're going to go to Boxers and see some cute guys. And every fucking Saturday night we end up asleep by 10 o'clock. It's really pathetic. We're not that old, we need to get out more. But back in 70, 69, I loved going out, and as young people do. So I remember, and this is something that those guys asked me about when they talked to me about the vibe at the Columbia dances and the vibe at GLF on 14th Street at the dances, not the meetings, was the vibe was a little more revolutionary, and the crowd was more mixed. There were more people of color. There were plenty of middle-aged folks, some older folks, a lot of poor people, a lot of people who I knew were far left. And it was really mixed, and it was a little rough around the edges, and I liked it. It felt a little forbidden and
more mixed than like
the
bars like
yes.
Julius.
Okay. God, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, Julius was almost all white,
Mm-hmm.
and occasionally you'd see a gay guy in there who was of color, but not very often. You'd see Latinos or black guys, but maybe they were 1 out of 20.
Mm-hmm.
And now everything is so mixed racially. Back then it wasn't. There were gay bars for black guys in Harlem that I read about, but I never went to one.
Mm-hmm.
But it was nice. The guys there were gentlemen at Julius, I thought. And it was a little more buttoned up. And right after gay liberation or after Stonewall, all of a sudden, I mean, if you look at the pictures from the Village after Stonewall, it was way different. The whole world was there now. It wasn't just people who lived there or who came in from Queens. There were groups of straight people wanting to see what the gays were up to. It was really integrated in every way, every sense of the word. So what's really amazing is I went like maybe the second or third time I went to GLF's dance. Guess who I see dancing like this? Michael Casey, the director of the Dalton Middle School. And he sees me, and he came over and he said, "Garrett, this will be our little secret." And I said, "Yes, sir." Just like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So these were the gay liberation dances on 14th Street?
Yes, and they were after the riot. I don't know how many months, maybe a month after they started, and now there's this big thing going on. The city or some developer wants to tear down the building where they were held because he wants to put up a huge office tower.
Which building was it?
69 West 14th is still there. It's on the northeast corner of 14th and 6th.
Okay.
And it's an old, crummy commercial building, and I hope they don't tear it down. And it was just amazing, it was great. And it was free, as I recall.
Yeah.
So a lot of guys, I mean, it was packed. There must have been 300 people up there in this second floor area for dancing. And I remember thinking, this is cool. And I also remember deciding not to tell my folks about where it was because they would be horrified. Because they'd think, well, is it safe? And I didn't want safe. I wanted stuff on the edge a little bit,
So was that area of town edgy at that time?
Back then, it was crummy. It wasn't edgy. It certainly was nothing like it is now. Right. I mean, there were some buildings there built in the 60s that were nice or okay apartment buildings, but it was rough a little bit. I mean, I remember almost being mugged in front of the Salvation Army there, and a girl I know was mugged there. But you know, that was all of New York. It was different, and a lot of neighborhoods were not as nice as they are. Well, I shouldn't say nice, not as fancy. I actually liked it more the old way when I could afford an apartment. You know, now it's cities. It seems very rich, Manhattan. And this Brooklyn is more expensive than Manhattan by square footage. It's insane. If I would have told you back then I'm moving to Brooklyn, you'd say, oh, I'm sorry. I thought, oh, why would you move to Brooklyn? Now, it's so happening. I was there the other night. I couldn't believe Brooklyn Heights. My God, there's a Maison Kaiser right there. I was involved in the student newspaper at Hunter College, and I was friends with a girl named Edna Negron who was Puerto Rican, and her father was a trucker. And he had bought a tenement at the base of Court Street in South Brooklyn. And I used to think, oh man, he'll have trouble unloading that thing. Guess what? They made millions of dollars when they sold it a few years ago. I mean, it's like...
But not at the time.
Not at the time. It was rough.
Yeah. How were the GLF dances different than like the vibe at the trucks, for instance? Because you said that the vibe at the trucks was really mixed and
it was.
democratic and all of that.
Yeah. Well, for one thing, the vibe at GLF on 14th Street was younger. These were not necessarily people from the bars the way the trucks were. The trucks were people who would come out of bars and go to the trucks afterwards. And GLF was all ages, but not particularly people that you would see in bars that I had ever seen before. They were rough around the edges. They were, it was definitely kind of proletarian, working class. You didn't see a lot of guys who looked rich there or dressed fancy in any way.
Suits, yeah.
Never. And I think that I wasn't one of them, but some of them were quite to the left. They were real radicals in all senses of the word. So if they were socialist or communist, some of them were Communist Workers' Party, some of them believed in violent overthrow. And that, of course, you know, there was a real kind of coming of age of the movement when GAA came up and GLF went down, and there was this thing of, I support gay rights, but I don't want to overthrow the U.S. government, you know, so it got supplanted. GLF was, it's time for violent revolution. Let's join others in violent revolution. And eventually enough people were saying, no, that's too much for me. I don't want to do that. I like living here. And so GAA took over and exploded in membership and bought a firehouse on Worcester Street, an old firehouse, and they had GAA dances. This is probably 72 or 3 by now, and it was huge. And I remember thinking, this is a city firehouse that has been given or rented or sold to GAA, and that used to freak me out, that the city went along with that.
It was like sanctioning it. Yeah.
I'd never seen that before. See, Robert F. Wagner Jr., the mayor of New York, and the grandson of, Wagner's had been running New York for century. He didn't like gay stuff. As a matter of fact, I met a man and his lover named Henry, not Mercer, but a famous gay neurosurgeon, Henry Messer, and his lover. And I befriended them years later, in 1980, when I was working in Detroit, and they had moved to Detroit from New York City. And one night, he says, let me tell you about what New York was like in the 50s. And he talks about walking on 8th Street between 5th and 6th and looking into a shop window and a cop coming up and would say, move along now. And what the cops would do is any single male looking into a store window on 8th Street, they wouldn't let them look. They would make them keep moving because they knew gay men were cruising and meeting up. And he said, you could be arrested if you didn't move when they told you to. That's how fucked up it was.
But that had obviously changed by the time you were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny. I know it sounds crazy, but I kind of wish I had been out and about in those years so I could see what it was like.
Hmm.
I knew of a man who was gay back when I was very young who committed suicide, who was an alcoholic and committed suicide, and so I knew I had heard of that stuff, but I hadn't really seen it in person.
Hmm.
Of course, everybody in my father's circle seemed to be alcoholic, but they weren't going to commit suicide. They were
Hmm.
just always drinking. Uh, so, well,
Okay.
should I ignore it? It's
Mm.
probably a junk call. Do you get a lot of fake calls, you know?
I do, increasingly.
Yeah.
Increasingly.
I want to know about Yale and how gay it is.
Oh, okay. But after
Okay,
I'm gonna ask like some final questions.
Okay.
Before you turn the tables.
Is this
on
the
me.
kind of stuff you want?
Oh yeah.
Am I
Yeah.
bad? Am
Yes.
I okay?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm thinking now as you look back on this period of your life in the Village and in Manhattan and the '60s, how do you think about just the legacy and the impact in your own life? I mean,
Hmm.
before we talk about like a larger cultural.
You know what?
Like
I
guess what kind of impact do you think this had on your life?
I wouldn't change it for anything. I didn't realize it at the time, but later I realized that the impact of the riots and the kind of birth of the modern day movement formed me and made me kind of realize that as a complete person, I have to include the gay part. And that I felt a responsibility to the community. For the first time, I got a real sense of this is my community. I belong here with them. I'm one of them. I had never felt that before.
Hmm. And you felt that when?
Certainly within 2 years after Stonewall, I felt it.
Mm-hmm.
And, went off to college and I wrote a letter saying, well, that's another story, but I will say that coming out, they say is a continuing process. And there were times in my life that I did not say that I was gay because I didn't want to get fired or I had a fear of being fired. When I went off to University of Denver in 1970, I wrote a letter anonymously, which they printed in the front page of the student paper, saying, "Where are all the gay brothers and sisters here?"
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't let them use my name, so I must have felt not so safe, And I saw a production in Denver then of The Boys in the Band at like a community theater. And I remember looking around and people were horrified. Horrified. And I just thought it was terrific and funny. And these people were like, A lot of religious people, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it definitely, within a short amount of time, when the movement formalized and when there was gay this and gay that, I always felt like I'm one of them. And as a youngster, I really didn't feel that. I thought I was gay, but I shouldn't tell anybody right away. And it was surrounded by shame a little bit, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But I quickly worked through it, and I think Stonewall helped me to work it through. It's like, yeah, we are gay. So the fuck what?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to play any games. I knew a guy who got fired from his job when they found out he was gay.
Mm-hmm.
He was an anchor man in Grand Rapids, Steve Kometko, and they pulled him in and said, "We know you're gay, and you'll never be the main anchor at this station, so you better find something else." And that was like 79 or 78.
Yeah.
So.
And can you talk a little bit about coming out? You talk about coming out as a process, coming out as a news anchor.
Oh, yeah.
Like what?
Well, see, I had been out in newsrooms since my first newsroom in '76 in radio in New Jersey. New Jersey, back to New York, worked at Channel 2, wanted to be on the air, went Fort Wayne, Detroit, Norfolk, Miami, New York, LA, New York. And in all those gigs, I was out in the newsroom. But in terms of being out on the air, I had never made a statement, I'm a gay man, until '94. I had this daily segment on the Channel 4 News in LA. I was the entertainment and media correspondent. I had 3 minutes a night. And the LA Times does a story saying, because I was on the board of GLAAD, I was doing all these things, and the LA Times said, why don't we do a story on you being out and gay and on the news every night? Mm-hmm. And so I asked my boss, and he said, yeah, okay, they can interview you. And he came, and he wrote this big piece. And then they thought it would be funny because I had told them I've never said anything on the air. I assume everybody knows. I get mentioned in the paper for being gay this, gay that. But he said, you haven't actually said it on the air. And I said, right. My boss gets fired for some other reason, and the new guy decides Glaser will never do this. We would rather not have him mention it. So the LA Times starts doing this thing every few days called Glaser Watch, or I called it Glaser Watch, and it was, is he out yet? Has he said anything? And this was funny the first time, but after 3 or 4 of these little blurbs, Glaser Watch, is he out? The station, KMBC, was not happy, and I was embarrassed. So I got called into the president's office, a woman named Carol Black, president of the station. She went on to run Lifetime TV. Very nice. And she said, Garrett, you're coming out today. So I guess there had been one too many of these little blurbs in the paper, and they just decided, you're going to come out. And I said, well, how? What would be the excuse for mentioning it? And she said, well, what do you have in your segment today? And I said, well, I have stories on this. I said, well, Elizabeth Glaser died from the Pediatric AIDS Foundation. I could do a little obit and say, as a gay man who's lost many friends to the epidemic, She said, yes, do that. And so I did it that day on the news, and got a few strange calls, or the receptionist did. You should shut up about that. We don't want to hear that, Mm-hmm. But also a lot of supportive calls. And the next day, the Times did a follow-up, Glaser finally out. Mm-hmm. So now when I see the whole world out on TV, I always want to go, hey, do you know what it was like back then? I was one of the first. But no one cares. It's a non-thing anymore. It's a non-story today, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I feel like these youngins, they ought to respect the older queens. We were there first. It had popped up a few times. When I worked in Lauderdale, I covered a plane crash once, and at a small airport way out west, and it was like a private plane that crashed, and we go out and shoot pictures, and I'm standing there writing notes, and this guy, he must have been a detective, he comes up, or maybe he was an FAA guy, he comes up and he goes, "You're the gay one, right?" And I had not come out or anything then. So people knew, obviously. The police knew. I knew a lot of cops.
Yeah. Because
I used to interview them, hang with them, and they knew. So obviously word a guy, hey, there's a guy on Channel 10 who's gay. So that kind of freaked me out when he said that. Oh, here's the dog horn. One of the things that I'm exploring in my book is balancing being a sexual revolutionary with being on TV. Mm-hmm. Hello, mister.
Hi.
Here, so we should stop